German ruling declares Google liable for false answers in AI overviews. I'm Dr. Samuel Alan Alexander, mathematician and philosopher, still here, and I'm going to be reading this thread of HackerNews comments on this news article about German ruling declaring Google liable for false answers in AI overviews. HFuffZen says, if I get it correctly, I like the ruling. So Google has established a product called Search. For that product, rules have been established. Google has monopolized that product. Now Google is replacing that product with a new product. But they keep calling it the same thing because they want to keep their monopoly. That is what has been deemed illegal. Gemini is not illegal. Pretending the worst version of Gemini is Search is illegal because it breaks the rules established for Search. But I am not a lawyer. It sounds like a pretty good description of what happened, and the way HFuffZen describes it, it sounds like a pretty sensible court ruling, albeit not one you would be happy about if you're a Google shareholder necessarily. Brainwad replies saying it has nothing to do with monopolies. Google was protected from defamation law with Search because the page title and snippets were direct quotes from the linked result page, whereas with AI overviews, the copy is written by a Google-controlled large language model. That's a very good counterpoint there. Keith NZ says, the irony of an article that makes a false claim about what Google was found liable for, and that very few are fact-checking it. The law they broke was a law protecting personal and business reputation against false statements of fact. Essentially, no one can say, I might be wrong, check yourself, but X is Y if that claim is essentially defamatory. Essentially, no one can say, I might be wrong, check yourself, but X is Y if that claim is essentially defamatory. That's a very hard statement to parse there. Anyway, Keith NZ continues, this is pretty good. I hope Google's approach is to make sure they don't end up making statements of fact like they did and use more appropriate wording like according to X, with direct disclaimer that they can't verify it. Even better that they look court documents to find any legal ruling and point people to that too. This whole comment is hard to parse. Rendell replies saying, what does the article say that differs from what you wrote? And Kajo says what he wrote is narrower than the headline. So it sounds like a very pedantic, sort of nitpicky comment. Swissek says, good. The true mark of AGI is when a company accepts liability and doesn't bury for entertainment purposes only deep in their terms of service, same as it works with employees. Same for self-driving. Your car is not self-driving until it accepts liability and you count as just a passenger. Haha, good point. But watch as Germany soon loses AI Google results. I love that comment about your car is not self-driving until it accepts liability. Yeah. Andrew Mutz replies saying, I think it's a completely reasonable position that companies making self-driving cars and question such answer systems are legally liable for any errors. But if you hold that position, you also have to be fine with companies not offering products and services in your country. AI systems will eventually be good enough, in 10 to 20 years, for companies to be able to deploy such systems with sufficient accuracy to afford the lawsuits. Well, that's a wild claim. Until that time, such countries would just not have access to systems before they were bulletproof. Right, this is the essential dilemma. As a regulator, the cost of regulating AI is you make people not be able to use AI. So it's very difficult. I'm glad I'm not a regulator in this space. Back at the top level, Freerin says, how could anything else make any sense? Platforms are getting used to provide dangerous, broken products and get away with it. There should be some limit to it. Next to Amazon that is selling AI-generated foraging books. And they link to a Guardian article. When I was a kid, it was possible to buy any foraging books from a store, and they had a minimum quality. Is that so difficult to achieve? Is profiteering not punished anymore? Of course, he mentions foraging because you could easily poison yourself to death if you got wrong information about how to forage for mushrooms, for example. T. Zubiri replies, well, they disclaimed and the user acknowledged. Yeah, but was it buried in some huge terms of service that nobody reads? At the top level, Sheep's Creek says, this ruling is actually a good thing. Google's official mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. Now, if that information is BS and cannot be relied upon, that's really bad. Leading people on and not delivering? Honestly, Google themselves should have been on it and not the German government. It's a bad look for them. Aside, I've noticed their AI model is pretty pathetic for troubleshooting something. 50% of the times, the first response is riddled with inaccuracies and mistakes. Repeat prompting is absolutely necessary, so do not expect to one-shot anything. Also, I'll admit that I still find myself using it because I'm lazy, and it's easier to talk to AI to get the right answer. Searching organically is hard these days, with the volume of content having gone up exponentially. This really touches a good point. We complain about Google having unreliable AI at the top of its search results, but as time goes on, increasingly more and more of the internet itself will just be AI generated. So the articles the articles Google is pointing to, how will you be able to rely on those? Gmark says, choosing the answer for you rather than leaving it to the user is a tremendous power, and the court correctly diagnoses it comes with responsibility to minimize harm to others in society. Yeah, I guess this applies if you assume that there are implicit guarantees or assumptions about the quality of the data. I mean, if I created a product that generates random fiction novels, random science fiction, then presumably I shouldn't be liable for the accuracy of the science in the science fiction novels. But in that example, there's no implied guarantees of reliability, and arguably Google is supposed to have some sort of implied guarantees. Weisa says, the ruling makes sense to me. When Google search is quoting a third-party website that happens to have bad information, that's not on them. Blame shifts to the third party. This is Google's privilege being a search engine. But when Google operates as an answer machine instead of a search engine, the privilege doesn't apply anymore. There's no third party to take the blame. Yeah, not much I can say against what Weisa is saying there. Let's see. Tantalor replies to Weisa and says, no, that's not what's happening here. Then the quote says, according to the court, the AI mixed up information about other genuinely sketchy companies with the plaintiffs and drew connections that didn't appear in any of the linked sources. Then Tantalor goes on and says, implying, if the false claim was found in the sources, then it would be protected speech. There's nothing special about answer machine versus search engine. You're making that part up. So I guess the subtle point that Tantalor is trying to get at is that what the court is talking about isn't so much about Google choosing the answer, but about the fact that Google is creating answers whole cloth which aren't in the original sources at all. M. Siemens gives a link to the ruling, and Stegotech says, it's a common sense ruling to me. AI is not equal to search because large language models are producing statements rather than search results the user has to interpret for themselves. It's the difference between searching a library's card catalog for a topic and a piece of software telling you its answer. The second these things came on the scene and confidently spoke lies at times, I knew this sort of lawsuit would be inevitable. Nice to see Germany got it right. And Ben O'All says, in this case, Google's AI had wrongfully linked two publishers to scams and shady business practices. Guess that's the end of their AI overviews in the EU. That's enough for now. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.